What you gonna do when the whole world's spinning? What you gonna do when the whole world's spinning? What you gonna do when just a few keep on winning? Gotta wake up and take a stand. What you gonna do when the whole world's burning? What you gonna do when the whole world's burning? When those that set the fire don't give a damn about learning. Gotta wake up and take a stand. Well, I believe there can be a better way. Oh, I believe we gotta stand up and say, oh, I believe starting today we gotta wake up and take a stand. Everybody gotta wake up and take a stand.
Really excited tonight to be welcoming Mark Pawlak and his new book, My Deniversity, part memoir, part craft, part historical witness that details the latter 60s and early 70s, and in particular his mentoring with Denise Levertov, one of the major 20th century poets. Mark hails from Buffalo, New York, and had a penchant for physics, wound up at MIT as a physics major. Mark, what sparked your love for physics? It's not one's first choice among many people. When you think of, majors, or it's sort of a rarefied, at least for me, it's rarefied. But there you are, in MIT from Buffalo. What's happening?
Well, I was part of, I'm part of the Sputnik Generation, right?
Okay.
And so I was really taken up with the whole effort to to catch up to the Russians,
Okay.
right? And all the money and propaganda invested in young people studying science, and it really just captured my imagination. And I guess as I learned more about it, I was sort of something of an autodidact. I kind of like taught myself a lot of things, and I built I built rockets. I built small Van de Graaff generators. I built small atom smashers and all these kinds of things. Read Scientific American, and they had a wonderful column. The amateur scientists, and basically would give you these projects to try, and I was just totally taken with that. And so physics seemed to me, the purest of the sciences. And that was that attracted me. And I think there's some parallel to get it eventually my later conversion to poetry being kind of there's something of a similar purity there that attracted me to poetry when I got invested in writing.
Yeah. So you're in your third year at MIT. You finally have a chance to have an elective. Your courses are prescribed up to then, and you sign up for this poetry course with Denise Levertov. I mean, she, obviously she has to accept you as with her other students. But what triggered that? I mean, why a poetry elective? Was it that were you into poetry at the time, or?
Yeah, good question. I mean, so I was generally sort of curious about a lot of things. I took classes with in Eastern religions and things which were popular in the counterculture of that era. And I did write poetry. I read in high school. I was forced to read traditional American literature. And I was really taken with Whitman in particular, and read his entire oeuvre on my own, just because I was just taken with his work. then I didn't write poetry until I got to college. I had a girlfriend who's a BU student who was an English major, and trying to impress her, I would write poetry. And it was really juvenilia, pretty awful shit. But that's what I did. And so I had a roommate who at MIT who was a year ahead of me and kind of a mentor, who was a writer. He was on the literary magazine at MIT. He was also a folk musician and wrote his own original songs and performed in coffee houses around Boston. And MIT had this, a remarkable provost who invited artists of all sorts to teach at MIT, including, so my friend studied with Lillian Hellman, who taught there the year before. And he said to me, he was about to graduate, and he said, well, next year, this poet, Denise Levertov, is going to be teaching. Why don't you try to get into her class? You've been writing some poems. And I thought, geez, I don't know. I don't take myself seriously as a poet. I mean, but I did. I went, I put my name on the list, and I went for an interview, and somehow I persuaded her. It's a mystery to me, but I persuaded her to let me into her class. She took me seriously enough, and so that's how I got there.
So you didn't know much of her reputation at the time.
I knew nothing about her. I had taken some literature classes. We were forced to take humanity classes at MIT. They were trying to humanize the engineers, as it were. And so I did read. I took a class in which I read Eliot and Yeats, and I love those classes. And I read, the only contemporary poets I read were the Beats. In one of my classes. So that was my complete knowledge of contemporary poetry, were Ginsberg, Corso, and Ferlinghetti. That was it.
It's interesting you bring up Ginsberg. While I was just preparing in the last few minutes for the show tonight, I thought of something he said many years ago that pertains to my Deniversity. And he said, when people asked him what he was doing, because he was always taking pictures and then writing long captions under the pictures, just literal paragraphs. And he said, I am documenting the sacred drama of our lives. Yes. And that, I thought, whoa, that's pretty profound. And to me, this is what you have done with my Deniversity. You really have, for whatever reason, many people have taken courses and have gone on to be poets, but very few have, recorded the intimate connections of what was going on. And this is a very specific time in U.S. history. There's all in tumult with the anti-war movement. The liberation movements are just coming into being. Native American women's movement, gay liberation. All of this stuff is happening just in this one period of time.
Yeah.
And here's Denise Levertov at MIT. Take us into her Deniversity. Take us in there. What's happening?
Yeah. So it's really an unusual experience, because here I've been studying, taking these physics classes with Nobel Prize winners, and who were up on a stage lecturing to 200 or 300 or 400 students, and there was no interaction. It was like them declaiming, and they were brilliant, and it was I was totally taken with it. And then here I am in this class with her, and she's like, well, I don't have the answers. I want you to talk to each other. I want you to read poems and tell each other what you're getting from the poems. Try to struggle to find a language to articulate what these poems mean to you. And that was just a totally different kind of experience, And also, I think I had only one other female instructor in all my years at MIT. So also there was that. And she was, this very powerful, dynamic personality. I mean, she just kind of bristled energy, there's a famous letter I read once in which Jay Laughlin, the publisher of New Directions, the famous avant-garde literary publisher, who was her publisher, said to William Carlos Williams, I read this poem that you sent me, Doc Williams, to Denise, and she was in my office, and she jumped up on the table and did a jig, right then and there. There was that kind of spontaneous energy that could burst forward from her at any moment. And I just never encountered anybody like that in my life. So that was really very special.
Well, in many ways, a particle of physics.
Sometimes frightening and sometimes frightening. I mean, it's like, wow, after I interviewed with her for this class, I went home. That night I had a dream, a nightmare almost, in which she appeared to me as the hookah smoking caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, saying, "Who are you?" Like, "Who are you?" And it was a nightmare. And then she appeared, and then she transformed into the Hindu goddess Kali, who severed heads, So that was, clearly my subconscious picked up that this was a rare breed that I was encountering, and it was kind of challenge me in many ways. Yeah,
it's interesting. In one of the places you described, one of your exercises for the class, she would have you write down your dreams.
Yes.
And apparently you had entered into her course with a dream, yes. A very profound.
Yes.
So they give Denise this little room at MIT, a little black box room. And so you go from these lecture halls of chairs that go down to a focal point of a person speaking. And she has you all sit in a circle. Yeah. And she insists right away that you call her by her first name.
Yeah.
And so that's how it begins. Yeah. And then apparently the room can't contain the energy. And so you move out into the lounge. And then that's not enough. So you go down to Harvard Square and you have a class in the old Harvard graveyard.
Yeah.
And that's not enough. So you take a trip down to the Cape, and she has all of these things arranged, and you're like poetry in motion. So tell me how that must have been. I mean, you're thinking in your head, I'm taking a course, and now you're down in Provincetown or in a graveyard, or what's going on?
Well, it was shocking and refreshing, and she just made it feel completely natural, and I subsequently learned over time that she's not someone who had any particularly formal schooling herself. She was homeschooled by her mother, who was a school teacher. They would listen to BBC educational broadcasts, and her mother would read. She once told me, "Yeah, I learned history by reading Balzac novels." With my mother, my mother reading aloud to me Balzac and Dumas, that was how and Dickens, and that was how I learned history. She did briefly, she took dance classes, and during World War II, she took some nursing classes, and she worked as a nurse's aide during the war. But those are the only formal schooling she really had. And so she didn't have any feeling of obligation to the protocols of higher education, and so for her it was like, well, this is a very confining space. Why don't we just move into other people's apartments or any other spaces that are more conducive to conversation and creativity, and we don't have to be in this black box, square box room. And that was, it was kind of illuminating to me, like, gee, you can do that. It was
Yeah.
liberating in a certain sense.
I thought of Socrates and his disciples walking around Athens, just
Yeah,
and then
well, and the title of my my memoir, My Deniversity, is echoes. Ezra Pound, used to tutor, mentor American poets who would come visit him in Italy in the 30s. And he, and basically they just hung out with him. They would have lunch with him, and they would hang at his house. They would type up manuscripts for him, and he would spout poetry and his philosophy of poetry, while they were in his presence. And he called it my Esuversity. And so I borrowed that idea, calling it my Deniversity. And that was, ultimately it was this sense of a very informal learning at the feet of a master of the craft.
And yet so, she herself had no formal training, and yet she found her own way to be in this position. You quote a passage from one of her essays, The Untaught Teacher.
Yes.
And I would like you to read that passage that I'd highlighted, if you can.
Oh, if I can find it. I didn't, Richard, I'm not sure I can find that piece right away.
Okay.
But the title of that of that section, the actual title of it's actually that essay from The Poet in the World, which I think we have an image of her book, The Poet in the World, that I shared with people. That was her experience as a teacher. She kind of invented it herself because she'd never had a formal educational experience. Yeah.
She talks about, just to paraphrase it, her to create a space where epiphany can happen.
Yes.
Not just individual, but a collective epiphany within a class. This is almost mystical to me, and not for the purpose of a subjective high, but for a doorway to a collective consciousness where you have a transcendent experience collectively, and then you take that and you shape that into poetry. And I found that very profound. I mean, I don't know anyone who had that, was working from that agenda, so to speak.
And she was very much influenced by the anarchist Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist Prince Kropotkin, who's who one of his major tomes was called Mutual Aid, and so he propounded this idea of of collective sharing and supporting one another, and that was really kind of the foundation of her. I'm scrolling through the book here trying to find this passage. That was a foundation of her philosophy in teaching poetry.
And yet she was always, or she came to this, at the time, she was very, she'd wedded her poetry to her politics. She was very much involved in the anti-war movement.
Yep.
And in your chapter on praxis, it's almost like a keystone in the arc of your book here, where it all comes together, her poetry and her belief that poets, all of us, have a moral responsibility to use our talent for the good. And at that time it was opposing the war in Vietnam, opposing racism, which she did not just through her words, which a lot of people did. They wouldn't get involved physically, but she got physically involved. Could you read her poem at the Justice Department?
Yeah. So
And give a context for that. And then,
So in the fall of 1969, there were two major marches. One, they were called the Moratorium. And in November, there was the November 15th Moratorium March on Washington in protest of the Vietnam War. Was at the time the largest demonstration in Washington ever. 500,000 people descended on Washington to protest the war. That was when Nixon famously, had Capitol Police and soldiers, snipers, on the roofs, of the various federal buildings in case, these wild, crazy anti-war demonstrators would. It's ironic, isn't it? With weapons, ready to shoot us if we should attack the buildings, and so it was a really important demonstration, one of the biggest ever. So at the Justice Department, November 15th, 1969. And so, of course, the authorities responded with tear gas and trying to break up things. So you can imagine, 500,000 people being tear gassed. Brown gas fog, white beneath the street lamps, cut off on three sides, all space filled with our bodies. Bodies that stumble in brown, airless, whitened in light, a mildew glare. That stumble hand in hand, blinded, retching, wanting it, wanting to be here, the body believing it's dying in its nausea, my head clear in its despair, a kind of joy, knowing this is by no means death, is trivial, an incident, a fragile instant, wanting it, wanting with all my hunger, this anguish, this knowing in the body. The grim odds we're up against, wanting it real, up that bank where gas curled in the ivy, dragging each other up, strangers, brothers and sisters. Nothing will do but to taste the bitter taste, no life other apart from. So there's the sense of, her moral anguish about the war in Vietnam, and feeling that it's important to it seems so remote. We see these images on the TV screen every night of body bags and firefights and napalming, et cetera, but it's thousands of miles away. So the sense of by protesting and being gassed, kind of feelings, making it physically real to her. It was something important that she felt she needed to do, and putting her body on, protesting.
and I get as if to wake herself up like a cold shower. So much the way a lot of us lived. Was in shelter to that. We didn't know that. That you were actually drafted. One of your co-students, Richard Edelman, was also very active politically, and you shared with me his perception in a poem, I think poem from the Barricades, another take on the same event. And so
right. So Richard was part of the sort of radical SDS contingent, and the sense was not to be passive resistance, but to aggressively fight against these the forces, and the phrase of let's bring the war into the streets, let's bring the war home, so that people can understand what we're doing far away in Vietnam. And so he was at the same demonstration, and a poem that he wrote, it actually was his first poem, a long poem called The Wedding Feast. Here's his take on the very same demonstration. They're not only at the Justice Department, but then the contingent that he was part of decided to attack the Saigon embassy and try to storm it. So here's his take on that. Thousands strong in the streets, drizzling rain, middle of the night in DC, going to the Saigon embassy, going to smash it, going to smash it, going to smash it, bring it down. Singing, we love Ho Chi Minh, we love Ho Chi Minh, we love Ho Chi Minh. Deep down in our hearts, deep, deep down, deep down in our hearts. And then the poem, goes on. I excerpted some pieces. And he says, bottles flying, bottles flying, bottles flying. We love Ho Chi Minh. Rocks flying, rocks flying, rocks flying. We love Ho Chi Minh. They got the clubs, they got the dogs, they got the gas, they got the guns. Fucking pigs running down the street, blind, choking my hand through a rock through the bank window.
Wow.
A very different take on that same experience of Denise's kind of accepting the tear gas as some kind of a catharsis, and the opposition and fighting the police, fighting the authorities of the younger radicals that Richard represented.
So it sounds like not only was she teaching, she was being taught, or
I think so.
I mean, she was from our parents' generation. She was born in 1923. We were.
She was my mother's age. Yeah,
exactly. And so here's this unusual figure. I'm trying to imagine my mother in this place.
Exactly.
It would never happen. And here she is, almost relearning or learning from the youth. That first a child will lead them, and she's taking her cues. So did Richard have an effect upon her when he was taking the class? I mean, he was obviously out there as a radical, part of the collectives. It sounds to me like she grew with the class as the class was growing with her.
Absolutely, and I think we were all growing at the same time. But she certainly was influenced. There were certain people who were kind of in the avant-garde of the radicalization, and Richard was certainly one of them. Those poems were in November of '69. In January, of that year, January of 1970, Richard and a contingent of MIT radical students stormed the president's office and occupied it. And Denise joined them. I went and sat in for a while to support them, but Denise was the only faculty member at MIT who stayed throughout the night with them, because she felt that having a mature adult faculty presence might deter the police and the campus police and the city police from storming the building and beating everybody up and dragging them out. And she did that, and she wrote a poem later, kind of dedicated to Richard, which I'd like to read, called "Let Us Sing Unto the Lord a New Song," which I think she wrote probably in May or June of 1970. So the kind of arc of that year that she taught at MIT, this is sort of where she arrived, being educated or being inspired by younger anti-war activists like Richard. There is a pulse in Richard that day and night says, revolution, revolution, revolution. And another, not always heard, poetry, poetry. Rippling through his sleep, a river pulse. Heart's fire breaks the chest almost, flame pulse, revolution. And if its beat falter, life itself shall cease. Heart's river, living water, poetry. And if that pulse grow faint, fever shall parch the soul, breath choke upon ashes. But when their rhythms mesh, then then though the pain of living never lets up, the singing begins. So, but when their rhythms mesh, then though the pain of living never lets up, the singing begins. So it's that bringing together of the impulse to change the world, fight oppression, and sing poetry that brings song as a resolution.
It's my word for that is being a living epistle.
Yes.
You become the embodiment of the poem, as in the act of resistance or in the act of protest or whatever it is you're doing, you sing it. In 1970, there were two other flashpoints that she was involved in. That one in January, there was a riot at Northeastern, a police riot, because the speaker there, their distinguished, I put that in quotes, speaker was Hayakawa, the president of San Francisco State, who was a defender of Reagan and was just everything anti the coming generation, what we're all about. And there was a huge demonstration there, and it got out of control, and the police just went berserk. And here's Denise. She's conflicted because on the same night, as I'm reading, she has a poetry gig in Cambridge. She wants to be at the riot with her students, with her body, and she can't, but she does somehow make it. By the end of her reading, she hops on the T and gets the Green Line to Northeastern. There's a passage there that describes the chaos. I think it's on page.
Yeah, I have it here. Yeah.
Please read that, because it shows. It's very dramatic. I mean, you can see it's almost like a movie.
Right. So it comes from a chapter called Praxis. And let me read the introductory paragraph of that chapter, and then I'll go to the movie reel. So it starts out with, one of Denise's guiding principles I quickly learned was her belief that as an artist, your life was whole and not compartmentalized, as hers certainly was not. Then it was inconceivable to share your work, poems in her case, both on the page and in public forums, without also sharing your convictions, especially in such troubled times when American urban ghettos were burning and an unpopular war was being waged overseas in Vietnam. From early in her career as poet activist, she viewed invitations to read her poems as opportunities to educate audiences about social injustice and the immorality of the Vietnam War, and to persuade them to join in social actions and resistance to the war's continuation. So that was the context there. Yeah, so she was doing a poetry reading as a benefit for Ecology Action, an early ecology organization, at that same night, and she felt she was obliged to do that. And so myself and fellow MIT poetry class student Margot Taft-Stever said, well, look, we'll go to the demonstration, and we'll call back to the church where you're doing your reading and give you reports. And if the demonstration is still going on, knowing Denise as we did, we knew that she would sort of talk about the demonstration and the importance of opposing somebody like Hayakawa. And she would recruit people from the audience to come with her after the reading was over to join the demonstration. And so, we were at this demonstration, and there's a big police phalanx, and we were on the outside trying to break through, and they would push us back, and we would go to a phone booth. The cell phones didn't exist. We'd find a phone booth and call back to the church and report in to somebody who was designated to tell Denise what was going on at the demonstration. And when her reading was over, we said to her, yeah, the demonstration is still active. Come on down, bring people, join us. And so she did. What we didn't plan on was we had taken the People's Bus, which you know about, that took us down Mass Ave to this demonstration at Northeastern. But she took the subway with a group of young men that she recruited from the reading. And the subway emerged from underground right in the midst of where right in front of Northeastern University, where there was a pitched battle going on between police and demonstrators. So we hadn't planned on that. We'd forgotten that there were multiple ways to travel from Harvard Square to Northeastern University. The Arborway branch of the Green Line subway, for one. It emerges from underground at the Huntington Mass Ave intersection, then continues on the surface with a stop at Northeastern. Half an hour after our last phone report, we saw, to our shock and horror, over the heads of the police, at the point where the subway disgorged passengers at the Northeastern University stop, Denise emerged from one Green Line car in the midst of the melee, followed by half a dozen young men. They were immediately surrounded by police, and the young men clubbed, cuffed, and dragged away to waiting vans. Although we could not hear what she was shouting, we could make Denise out over the heads of the police and through the clouds of tear gas, her arms flailing, shouting at the riot police as she followed behind her young comrades. Our contingent was eventually pushed back onto Mass Ave, and when police reinforcements arrived, and then we were dispersed with tear gas, there was no way we could reach Denise. All the other avenues of access to the campus were blocked. So Margot and I returned to Cambridge. Meeting up the next day, Denise told us she was never arrested, no doubt because of her age and professional attire, but had spent the night in the jailhouse helping to arrange bail for those who were.
Well,
And then you mentioned the other event. So 6 months later or so, after the massacre of students at Kent State, there was a memorial at Goucher College. I wasn't present, but Denise wrote a poem about that, which I'll read now. There was a memorial for the 4 students killed at Kent State, and Denise was invited to read at this memorial, and so she wrote a poem called "The Day the Audience Walked Out on Me and Why." May 8th, 1970, Goucher College, Maryland. Like this, it happened. After the antiphonal reading from the Psalms, and the dance of lamentation before the altar, and the 2 poems, Life at War and What They Were Like, poems of her own, I began my rap and said, yes, it is well that we have gathered in this chapel to remember the students shot at Kent State. But let us be sure we know our gathering is a mockery, unless we also remember the Black students shot at Orangeburg 2 years ago, and Fred Hampton murdered in his bed by the police only months ago. And while I spoke, the people, girls, older women, a few men, began to rise and turn their backs to the altar and leave. And I went on and said, yes, it is well that we remember all of these, but let us be sure we know it is hypocrisy to think of them unless we make our actions their memorial actions of militant resistance. By then, the pews were almost empty, and I returned to my seat, and a man stood up at the back of the quiet chapel near the wide open doors through which the green of May showed and the long shadows of late afternoon, and said, my words desecrated a holy place. And a few days later, when some more students, Black, were shot at Jackson, Mississippi, no one desecrated the white folks' chapel. because no memorial service was held.
Wow. Wow. That's profound.
And it's I mean, she sort of anticipated in some ways Black Lives Matter. I mean, she was there then, all those years ago.
I remember that struggle. I mean, there was this, these white students are killed, but then no one's mentioning the Black students, except that there are some that are, and Denise was one of them. And she's almost in a prophetic witness place. She's putting her body between, the forces of evil and the forces of light. And she's the bridge. And the bridge is her poetry. And her body is in the poetry. And the poetry is in her body. It's I'm thinking her contemporaries, Robert Creeley, what are they doing? I mean, not to disparage them, but her contemporary poets of that time, they were not out there with their bodies. They were maybe writing poems about it from their offices or desks, but she was physically engaged.
Yeah.
And that to me is profound.
Yep. No, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, there was, and Robert Bly, who recently passed, helped found the Poets Against War. And yeah, they were opposed to war. They gave poetry readings in opposition to the war and tried to generate, public interest in opposition. But yeah, they didn't put their bodies on the line, as the phrase of the times was, like Denise did. And and she came from a tradition. Her husband Mitchell Goodman was also an a very important, prominent anti-war activist. He famously in I think it was 1967 led a walkout at the National Book Awards because Hubert Humphrey was the guest speaker. Vice President Hubert Humphrey was the guest speaker at the National Book Awards, and he led a walkout of writers, and he yelled at Humphrey, we're killing children in Vietnam, and it was a very widely reported thing. And then he helped found an organization called Resist, which was trying to advocate for resistance to the authority of, and particularly the military draft. And he was actually part of the first conspiracy trial 2 years before the Chicago 7, the famous Spock trial, in which he, Dr. Benjamin Spock, the famous baby doctor, and William Sloane Coffin, the chaplain at Yale University, plus two younger men, were indicted by the feds on conspiracy to persuade young men to resist the draft. There was a big trial in Boston federal court in 68, 69. They were all convicted. And then on technicalities, they eventually got off. So Mitch, so Denise and Mitch were, two very prominent, active anti-war activists at the time. And then Denise, famously or infamously, traveled to North Vietnam at the height of the war in 1972. And like Jane Fonda, they were accused of being traitors, by the popular press. And she was in the company of Jane Hart, who was the wife of a congressman from Colorado, and the poet Muriel Rukeyser. The three of them traveled throughout North Vietnam to bring back the message of what they observed about the bombardments and the effects of the war on people in North Vietnam. And there are some posters. There's a poster of I think that we posted of her a fundraiser she did when she returned about the Bakmai Hospital, which had been bombed by American B-52s, which was providing aid to medical aid to Vietnamese civilians, and then shall I read that section from the memoir called War?
Yes,
I
please.
take a moment to say that. So there it is.
Set the context of, well,
Yeah. So this is, the fall of 1972. Denise has just returned from Hanoi. And she and her husband, Mitch Goodman, had a farmhouse in Temple, Maine, where they would kind of retreat from the city. And in the summers, they would go there and write. And I was invited to spend Christmas with them that year. And so I was there, and while we were there, there was a great snowfall. It blanketed the fields in soft curves and covered the tree limbs in white. And we were, snowed in this remote. Their house was at the end of a dirt road, at the end of a highway, a very remote place. And then an ice storm followed the snowstorm, which left the gravel road slick and impassable for several days. Trees were encrusted in ice. Stranded in the farmhouse in remote Temple, we heard news over the radio of Nixon's Christmas bombing of Hanoi. So he and Kissinger initiated a B-52 bombing of Hanoi. They were trying to cripple the Hanoi government, the North Vietnamese, and bring them and trying to get them to come to the negotiating table. They're trying to use bombing as a way of persuading them to negotiate. The phone lines in Temple were mercifully not down. Denise and Mitch took turns making calls to the outside world, New York, Boston, Washington, trying desperately to mobilize friends, poets, and movement activists to stage demonstrations against what they viewed as an atrocity, this bombing. Denise was inconsolable, given to fits of frustration at being unable to vent her outrage. Mitch was calmer and methodical, wearing his organizer's hat. This is when Denise wrote her most violent poem. It's called A Poem at Christmas 1972 during the terror bombing of North Vietnam, in which she imagines herself an assassin whose targets are Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. The bombing was also a precipitating event that led Denise to sever ties with many poets she had long considered colleagues and comrades. The time for reading poems as a form of protest was over, she felt, and announced publicly in another poem, Goodbye to Tolerance, a poem written during the same winter in Temple. To oppose genocide, she passionately believed, writers, among others, had to, in the parlance of the times, put their bodies on the line, engage in direct actions, and bring the war home. Yet to express her intolerance for tolerance, she had written a poem. So I'll read this poem. It's from The Freeing of the Dust, another one of her collections. So a poem at Christmas 1972 during the terror bombing of North Vietnam. Now, I should add that Denise was steeped in the literature of the great Russian novelists, Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Tolstoy, and so the famous Decembrists who in the late 19th century tried to assassinate the Tsar, I think was on her mind when she wrote this poem. Now I have lain awake imagining murder. At first my pockets were loaded with rocks, with knives. Wherever I ran, windows smashed, but I was swift and unseen. I was saving the knives until I reached certain men. Yes, Kissinger's smile faded. He clutched his belly. He reeled. But as the night wore on, what I held hidden under a napkin, perhaps, I, as a witness at the inaugural dinner, was a container of napalm. And as I threw it in Nixon's face and his crowd leapt back from the flames with crude yells of horror, and some came rushing to seize me. Quick as thought, I had ready a round of those small bombs designed to explode at the pressure of a small child's weight. And these instantly dealt with the feet of Nixon's friends and henchmen, who fell in their own blood while the foul smoke of his body oils blackened the hellish room. It was of no interest to imagine further. Instead, the scene recommenced. Each time around, fresh details, variations of place and weapon, all night imagining murder. Oh, to kill the killers.
Wow.
So I it's quite an astounding poem, and and I think only her deep involvement in Russian literature could have led to her such an imaginative recreation of an assassination of a czar or a president.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing at that time.
Hmm.
I mean, to be that graphic and specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you said, it drew a line in the sand between her and her fellow poets and comrades that no one went there.
Yeah.
No one went there. She
Right,
went there.
right, yeah.
And
She accused them of being genial poets.
genial poets, my wow. Let's move on to her latter days. You maintained a relationship with her, beyond the 70s into the 80s. You've switched from physics to poet, and you're teaching. You're in Worcester, but you're still part of her inner circle. You still have a communion with her that still feeds your life and her life, obviously. Tell me about those times a little bit, just however you.
Well, there was a period of time where she was still living in Somerville at Glover Circle outside Davis Square, and one of the images we have here is the cover of her collection of essays, a terrific collection of essays called "The Poet in the World," and the cover image, if people look at it, is her study, her desk looking out on Davis Square. In the background there is the Somerville Theater out the window. And so you see her glasses on the desk, books open, and in the distance is Davis Square. And the essays are about poetry and political commitment, really her philosophy of life, and her wonderful craft essays, which are frequently quoted about the function of the line, how to break the line, and the way one constructs a poem effectively using voice and sound and line break. It's a great collection, and I think everybody should, any poet should read it. And I was very fortunate. We lived near one another. She lived in Davis Square. I lived just across Mass Ave in North Cambridge, and she was teaching at Tufts at the time. And I had the opportunity to just basically drop in at her house anytime. I could take books out of her library and read them, and just engage in conversation whenever she wasn't busy. And so that was really, as I said, that whole idea of that was my Deniversity. That was my education in poetry from Denise Levertov. And then she eventually she left Tufts. She started teaching every semester at Stanford, one spring semester each year, and eventually and traveled a lot. So we started to see less and less of each other. And then she eventually moved and relocated to Seattle in her last years, where I think she was strongly influenced by the aesthetics of poets and photographers and painters in the Pacific Northwest, where the landscape, nature was a very powerful presence. She has many poems about observing Mount Hood out the window of her house in Seattle. It's almost like the famous sequence of Hokusai woodcuts of Mount Fuji. The different perspectives of this looming mountain were a strong presence in her life. And she always wrote nature poems. There was almost a sacramental quality to her nature poetry, and I think she kind of returned to that. And I thought I'd read. And she also became, her family. Her father came from a Russian Hasidic family of rabbis, but converted to the Church of England. He became a minister of the Church of England, and so there was a very strong religious background in her childhood, and her mother was descended from a famous Welsh mystic,
Really?
a tailor who used to sew mystical sayings into the seams of the garments that he
Really?
yes.
That is, yeah, Celtic.
Maybe I'll read that. So maybe I'll read that poem. It's
Yeah.
an early poem. It's one of my favorite poems. It's called "Illustrious Ancestors." The Rav of northern white Russia declined in his youth to learn the language of birds because the extraneous did not interest him. Nevertheless, when he grew old, it was found he understood them anyway, having listened well, and as it is said, quote, prayed with the bench and the floor. He used what was at hand, as did Angel Jones of Mold. This is the Welsh ancestor, whose meditations were sewn into coats and breeches. Well, I would like to make thinking some line still taught between me and them, poems direct as what the birds said, hard as a floor, sound as a bench, mysterious as the silence when the tailor would pause with his needle in the air.
Oh, go.
Yeah. It's a very early poem from the early 1960s from a collection called The Jacob's Ladder. Let me read so I think she came kind of full circle.
It sounds, yeah.
Yeah, she came, returned to writing nature poems. She returned, she became close to the the Episcopal Church at first here in the Boston area, and then in Seattle, she became close. She became a Catholic. She actually converted to Catholicism, and actually wrote a whole poem that was a mass that was performed in churches at one time. But I thought I'd read this last book of hers, poems that she wrote as she was dying. She died of leukemia in 1997. So next year this year in the fall will be the 25th anniversary of her death. Can't believe she's been gone that long. I'm hoping we can have some kind of event to commemorate her life in Somerville, where she lived later this year. The Great Unknowing, these are her last poems. And I wanted to read one because I think it's captures her interest in people. She was a lyrical poet, but she also was very observant of people and had a sense of humor, and wrote poems kind of observing the behavior of others. And this is one of my favorites. It's called The Poodle Palace. So this is written when she was living in Seattle toward the end of her life. I never passed the Poodle Palace with its barber pole in the shape of a striped barred-boned bone and the sign specializing in large and matted dogs, without remembering the bitter wonder of the taxi driver from somewhere in India who asked me, "What is that Poodle Palace? What does it mean?" And when I told him, laughed, and for blocks, laughed intermittently, a laughter dry as fissured earth, angry and sharp as the ineradicable knowledge of chronic famine, of human lives given to destitution from birth to death, a laugh in which the stench of ordure simmered round with a fog of flies hovering, a laugh laughed to himself, whether in despair or hatred, and not as a form of address. He was indifferent to whether I heard it or not.
Wow.
Isn't that great?
That's wow. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. That and the Welsh poem. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your work, My Deniversity, for giving us an inside view, an intimate view of one of the great poets, and props to yourself for having the foresight to record that sacred drama of your life and her life during that time, and for bringing it to closure. If anyone, I don't want to have questions for Mark, we can open it up to that at this point. Does anyone have anything to say?
Yeah, Mark, you want to say something about a couple of other things? She was so close to music, and that's an important thing, I think, just to mention. She played the piano.
Yeah.
She loved music.
She loved music, and she loved music. She loved painting. She loved photography. All her book covers are photographs. That she selected. And she loved. She really loved music, and so when she talked about poetry, she borrowed the characterization, of the modes of which a poem works, and this was something that she got from Ezra Pound, who in his pedanticness used the Greek, phanopoeia, logopoeia, and melopoeia, meaning sight, sound, and intellection. So those were the three modes, primary modes that in which poems worked. So sight.
I thought that was paella. Was I wrong about that?
That was later on after dinner, where that would be the paella. Yeah. So sight would be the imagistic elements. Sound, of course, was the music, and then the logical element would be the philosophical underpinnings, and whenever she talked about a poet's work or a poem, she would cite those three things and say, well, this is a poem that's really logopoetic, or this is a poem that's really melopoetic. And she favored, even though I think Well, her own poetry spanned the whole, all three of those elements. But you know, as she evolved later in her life, I think she moved more and more toward preferring the musical elements.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
You know, Mark, it's so unusual. It strikes me as unusual that someone who is so counterculture would be later in life, or perhaps throughout, someone whose religion was on the conventional side. I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think. I mean, I think she had. I mean, I was living still here in Boston, and so I didn't. You know, I wasn't in much contact with her late in life during that period of her conversion, and so I experienced it largely through the poems she was writing. But I mean, I think there was always this, element of mysticism, mystery, something verging on the religious. And I'm sure, she found her own way of accepting or adapting those elements to lead to her conversion. I think she liked ritual too. I think she liked attending services and the music, the hymns. I think hymns were very important to her. They're just something from her childhood, and so there's a certain comfort one takes. Certainly, growing up Catholic as a child and having rebelled, against the formality and rigidity of it. I still occasionally like to go to a service and enjoy the rituals are comforting to me. And so I think she, later in her life, she was suffering aging and illness, and she must have taken comfort, I think, in returning to the rituals of religion. I don't know if that if it quite answers your question.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much.
So when she did finally kind of say, that's it, you got to put your body on the line for this, you can't just write poetry. What was her, I mean, did she only have a small group of poets that she hung out with after that? Or did people kind of jump in, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a period where she was really kind of cut off from people who were largely her contemporaries, and who had been her, colleagues. I mean, perhaps the most famous breakup in her poetic relationships was with Robert Duncan. There is, I have it behind me here, I'll pull it out, a massive tome of, you can see how thick it is. This is the complete correspondence between Robert Duncan and Denise Levertov over a period of 15 years, in which, it's one of the great correspondences about modern contemporary poetry, and it's one of the richest volumes I could recommend to anybody. And they, after all these years of kind of growing together as poets and sharing their ideas, and they had a falling out over her anti-war poems, and they never reconciled. So that was really, she saw him as a colleague, a friend, and in some ways a mentor, and it must have been devastating to her, to have him attack her for political poetry during the war. And so that's only one, probably the most extreme example, but yeah. So yeah, and so I think she found solace in younger poets, like myself and some of the other people who were her proteges in a sense, and so we had the luxury of spending a lot of time with her, and and she learned from us, and we learned enormous amounts from her, obviously, and her mentorship really launched us as poets, I would say. Well, thank you all for joining in, and thank you, Richard.
Very, very
Aspect, as I said to you earlier, Richard, before we got started, there's lots of ways to slice and dice this memoir and talk about different aspects of Denise, and this is one I really want. Her political engagement is something I really wanted to have the opportunity to explore in greater depth, and so I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and to have someone who himself was there as as an interrogator of the discussion is really special. So thank you.
That's great.
You're most welcome, Mark. It was just amazing, beyond words.
I believe starting today, we gotta wake up and take a stand. Everybody gotta wake up and take a stand. Do you hear me? Gotta wake up and take a stand.